But the conference has convinced me that there's so many different points of view, so many different ways of attacking field work, and it's just been really gratifying. And I'm just impressed with how Linda and has put together an amazing program. Over lunch I was saying, but we haven't talked about technology yet, and lo and behold, we then had a panel on innovation, so it's all coming together. We've heard about models for community building. We've heard about women of the wild. We've heard about amazing sacrifices of individuals in the field and experiences that have completely transformed their careers. We've heard about cowboy science. We've heard about bumblebees and field notes. We've traveled to Madagascar and all points of Africa. We've heard a lot about museums and archaeology, linguistics, reviving lost languages. We've heard about extraordinary training programs to build the next generation of field biologists and marine scientists. We've heard about drones and efficiency, and we've heard about long-term ecological research. So it's just been an amazing journey over these past few days, and I think we should just give one more round of applause for our panelists and speakers. And we should just open it up for questions. I think it's probably best if we think of broad synthetic questions that might apply to most, if not all, of our panel leaders.
Hi, it is Fernarine from UC Berkeley. So my question is, can something that stood up across all of the panels is like over skills than just research, like you need organization, accounting, mentoring. So I was wondering, what are your views on like how to acquire those skills? Most of us acquire those on the fly in the field or like through collaborations, but do you think that should be part of the curriculum as a grad student, or just like still something to be learned on the side?
Well, I used to tell my students there were two skills that they should have before they go into the field. One was first aid, and the other was motor maintenance. And in terms of, we were talking about the length of the PhD program. And I think what one of the issues is, how much can we cram in and still maintain the interest of the students? Because I know with myself, I was a Ford Foundation trainee student in my first major archaeological excavation, which was in the south of France. And I learned so much there. It was being embedded in that environment that really encouraged me to learn the skills that I needed to learn. And I don't know whether I would have gone after those as avidly as I did without being embedded in the field. So, you know, I'm not sure how many transferable skills we can force our students to do and still have a fairly rapid movement into the fieldwork and the science. That's just my feeling about it.
I think that's a really good point. There's a limited amount of time we can train you when you're a larval scientist. And you get to train yourself, learn as you go, you know, when you're doing it. I think that's a lot of what a research experience is about, too. And your research skills are transferable. You know, they're transferable to the kinds of other problems you'll find in the field. Although, yeah, auto mechanic, airboat mechanic, in my case when I was doing my research, my dissertation in the Everglades, you know, it's, there are skills like that you just have to go with. Communication, though, that is one thing I think we try to teach, science communication, but that needs to be a broader set of skills that we can probably teach and pass on. Take a shot.
I've always worked at a small enough scale that I've just done stuff myself, but in the field I'm in, there are jobs in archaeology for cultural resource management, and that work is much more workplace facing and involves workplace standards that in my department, we're starting a 5th-year master's program for our undergraduates, and that means adding curriculum and committing to teaching courses and talking to people in that industry, and they say, these are the things we want to hire your students to do. And some of the things include saying this is a workplace. You need to know about harassment. You need to know about dealing with landowners. You need to, and so there's maybe that divide between the thinking part of archaeology and the doing part of archaeology. Some of this, I think that we can find a place where we need to commit to training students who can work in that part of archaeology. And a lot of that would fit into bigger projects, but I've never had the luxury of the funding to have folks doing that.
With the implosion of federal funding, this last panel was really impressive in the sense of Nancy being able to co-locate with ecotourism, Jill starting her own non-for-profit, and then Jennifer kind of embodying the spirit of Ben Franklin in his independent scholar. Are there new innovative models in order to help support this persistent of vision and sustainability and diversity in the research? Because in business, most small business do radical innovation. Most big businesses don't. And this is where the creative leaps happen in research. Like universities have business incubators. Are there incubators for independent researchers to make those leaps? Or new models?
And you guys feel free to.
You've been trying to keep something going
Yeah.
for a long time using very creative means.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I can just speak from personal experience. I also helped to start a research program about 25 years ago in Ecuador and have managed to keep it going this whole time. And there's been, lean times and fat times and times when, we've had to really stretch to make it happen. But the general approach that we've taken is, to form an in-country NGO, establish a reserve, and then build infrastructure on the reserve in the form of, housing for about 60 visitors. And then I helped to develop a program called the Tierra Program, 2-lane interdisciplinary environmental research and action program that has some similarities to Paul's program in marine science, although that's definitely an aspiration for us, many of those points. But one key difference of that program is that we are lowering and trying to remove financial barriers to involvement by students, so that that's not a barrier. But at the same time, an explicit goal of that program is to channel funds to the station where the research happens in Ecuador. So we get about 70 or so visitors per year that are coming down to the station to paying to stay there on field courses, or that the program at least is paying for it, and that sort of helps in a Robin Hood-esque kind of way to send both human and capital down there, and that's helped to, together with foundational support, federal grants, and then that income piece as sort of, those have been like the 3 legs of the stool that in different years, different pieces have come together, but that's managed to keep things afloat and growing for the last few years. So.
Your question raises an interesting point, though, because archaeology back in the late 19th and early 20th century was patron-based. The big projects were run by people who had money, and you would find a way to get into their pocket, and you would go do your research. And so I see a danger here with the implosion of research funds from federal sources, as well as likely foundations as well, because they're going to be pained by this as well, that some of the negative aspects of getting your patron in line might be more than you want to swallow in terms of being able to work with that kind of context. So I wanted to add that cautionary note, because I've worked with patrons too, and sometimes they're really great, and sometimes they're like, why don't you do this for me? It's like, I can't do that. That's not ethical. And so these tensions exist when you begin to bring other sources of funding that are not constrained by other than their interests, their own personal interests, into this mix.
I think we have to be creative. That's the bottom line, really, and find partners wherever we can, whether it's, gold miners, gold diggers. I don't have any better answers than that, but different, also, I think, like different taxa are, some things are more charismatic, or places are more charismatic, or questions are more charismatic to funders, so.
Is there cooperation between research initiatives to help the independent producers so you don't have to compromise with big donors? I mean, is there an incubator to look innovatively for building that creative capital?
We need one. You know what? We need one. There's a space out there to create something, I think, that could really help, especially the kinds of long-term studies in other countries that really are very difficult to maintain, but often don't take a lot of money.
Although it is worth saying that the NSF does have programs that are specifically focused on convergence between basic research and, and business, and developing those synergies.
If I could just add, having run a funding not-for-profit, we grappled with this a lot of what type of funding should we actually be supporting. And the problem with long-term funding is it locks, in my case, the not-for-profit into funding specific research rather than nurturing new research orientations. And we made a decision that, we would entertain a bridging grant or whatever, but it would be detrimental to us as a funding organization to commit to one or a handful of long-term support where the researchers became totally dependent on us. So it is a real issue of how you can best use the relatively limited research funds you have.
I've been delighted by the different disciplines and hearing about how different people are integrating their research with the different problems that were listed in the program. But I'm also struck by the fact that when I hear you talking about the way you organize your research, the way you organize field programs, the way you try to collaborate with communities, and the way you try to create sustainable programs, it doesn't seem to matter what discipline you're in. I hear exactly the same things, and apart from the actual terms, apart from MISNet, say, it could be an archaeological project instead of a BAT project. And I'm just curious about the logistics of research and the practicalities of fieldwork. If there are programs that encourage folks from one discipline to go out on a project in another discipline where they're learning the mechanics and the logistics instead of the ultimate research goal. I'd love to go on Nancy's project and I'd learn an incredible amount about organizing archaeological projects where we've got multiple nationalities, multiple sub-disciplines that are trying to do the same thing at the same time and tripping over each other spectacularly. Is that something that's done?
There are big archaeological projects that have been, the work at Çatalhöyük is a really good example in archaeology of multi-nation, multi-investigator, multi-fundings of all different kinds, and they actually were quite successful for a long time in terms of creating that infrastructure. But like many things, it ran out of funders. It ran out of donors. It ran out of steam, even in Turkey. And so, you know, how long is long-term? How long is sustainable? You know, you asked that question earlier today. One of you did say, what's sustainability for exactly? And that's one of the questions that we never really answer very well in these things. So, you know, there are examples out there, but they all seem to kind of run into, you know, entropy as, you know, part of the nature of our world in some sense. And I think that's what happens in some cases. But Nancy's project is quite different in that sense.
Yeah, and that question really struck a chord with me because, you know, starting about 10 years ago, that what you're describing really became sort of the core focus of my career in many ways. And, you know, so the backstory is that we have this one area in Ecuador, you know, it's about, you know, 20 miles by 10 miles, a rectangle, you know, and within that there's a mix of forest and communities and what on a personal level, what I've really dedicated my career to is just trying to understand those relationships between the decisions that people make in terms of how they manage the resources there in the land and how that affects the environment and how that circles back around to affect the people that live there, and just those incredibly complex relationships, and then working with this Ecuadorian community-led NGO, try to have interventions that hopefully move the needle in a positive direction at, you know, critical points in those relationships. And so in a very focused kind of way, what I've tried to do is cultivate, if not collaborative relationships, at least like bringing people in from different disciplinary lenses to try to understand different aspects of that, you know, complex set of relationships. And the broader goal would be, you know, to gain a more holistic and nuanced understanding of that system, with the goal of not just increasing basic scholarship within and between disciplinary silos, but also translating that through to real world impact. And that's definitely a work in progress, but that's a goal for me.
I think we maybe would be remiss if we didn't mention the NSF Long-Term Ecological Research Program, which has sites specifically selected through competition to support multiple researchers examining different aspects of the ecosystems. And it's a little different than sort of the projects that you heard about in our panel, which are more like individual researchers or small groups that have come together. NSF has been good in funding this long-term research there that might have, I don't know, a site might have 25 investigators involved in it, something like that. They typically had been, you know, beautiful wild places, but a couple decades ago they realized urban ecosystems were a frontier that hadn't been really understood well. And I do believe that even through that particular couple of those LTER, there have been more social scientists involved in aspects of that work, which is a bit unusual for the more natural science-y sites that have been supported. Funding has been running out on that program, and sites, some controversially, have been discontinued. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, if you know anything.
Me or?
I didn't know Scott.
Yeah, no, it's, you know, NSF, for all of us, I'll just do a bit of reminiscing now about the good old days, but it is extraordinary in lots of ways that are relevant to this conference. Many of you have worked with the Collections in Support of Biological Research. That's a huge, it's one of the only such funding streams for biological collections that I'm aware of, even globally. And then, of course, the long-term ecological studies. And yeah, we were hit hard at Harvard with the Harvard Forest losing its long-term study, yeah. And, you know, it's going to be a new normal, and I think these discussions about alternate funding are being are being talked about in many different contexts in different universities, because university administrators realize that it's going to be tough to rely so much on federal funding in the future.
Field stations are like museums, but in far out places that administrators don't see, you know? Yeah, so it makes them even more susceptible in certain ways.
I think I'd add to that, it's not just a receding of funding, but what we're seeing is a receding tide of institutions in general. Universities give less time to their faculty. There are fewer faculty with the money and the space on campus that they can depend on. Museums are fragile institutions as well. And I think what people are wrestling with in the big picture here is we've been talking about building utopian communities here, and how fragile those can be. They need this charismatic leadership, and then they can fall apart. And then the opposite of that is what is working is where people build these new institutions and kind of principalities, where they say, we got land, and we build buildings on it, and we got a stream of money that's protected that we control, and that keeps the people here and allows us to replicate it. And a lot of the question is, how do you do that from the bottom up? And I think it's a hard thing for early career researchers to be tasked with that extra work of bootstrapping at just one more level of getting into a field that is just not there institutionally. And yet, I think it's really exciting. I think that idea of interdisciplinary partnership, I never would have thought of that 10 years ago, to say, hey, it would be really cool to work at a site that's an archaeological park and to coordinate with folks that are doing the ecology or folks that are doing the other things there, because we have the same kind of land and resource interests and the same reason to be in the place.
Yeah, and I'm just reminded of two really important documents to our community, both spearheaded by NSF, but then articulated by the National Academy of Sciences. And those are there was a really nice report on biological field stations and marine labs. I think that was probably 2015 or so, but that's still very relevant and has a lot of great ideas in there about long-term sustainability. And then, of course, there was another one, more like 2021, on support of and the value of biological collections. And so those documents are there, and we should turn to them for solace and advice and thinking about the future.
All right, so I'm a PhD student. I study conservation, and I don't quite have a question. I have more of a personal anecdote in regards to the panel on inclusivity that I thought would be maybe a good prompt for reflection. Although before I say that, I do want to say that I've noticed it feels like a common thread from everything everyone has talked about, beyond just this drive for scientific inquiry and like sort of finding out the truth about different things and understanding them, is actually kindness, which has sort of struck me in a way, because I think it's not always something we talk about. And so maybe a question I'll ask before I tell my story is, at what point in your careers, you know, some of you have mentioned wishing that you'd done things differently earlier. Was there anything that motivated you to think like, you know, maybe I could do this differently and it would be more beneficial from everyone? Like, that's doing it the hard way in a sense, but doing it in the better way. So I guess that's my question. But the story I have to tell is earlier this year, there was a international conference that was relevant to my field of study that I really wanted to go to. And despite the fact that the organization hosting the conference had, you know, a code of conduct and a non-discrimination statement, as I was researching about travel to attend that conference, I found out that the country the conference was being held in, were I to travel there, at best, I would have been deported, and at worst, I may have been imprisoned for something about myself that I have no control over. And it struck me that the organizers never made any note of this. And so I guess it's sort of a prompt for reflection for people who are in a position to organize conferences, who are trying to bring people from all over the place to discuss, you know, important work that's being done, of like, consider are choices you're making excluding people from those spaces by the nature of them just being part of human diversity. Thank you.
I'll take up an element of that with just the observation that I work in a field that has been very homogeneous as an academic discipline, and that some of my regrets are blinders from a positionality that that I wasn't, and we weren't asking questions that didn't occur to us. So the Me Too movement through archaeology was the first time I actually turned around to female graduate students and said, I've never asked you about your experiences in the field. I assume that when we walk down the streets in Peru together, that we have a similar experience. And I learned that I was absolutely wrong. And so from trying to think of myself as being someone who's tried to train people of any background, and realizing that the sheer homogeneity of the environment in which I'd always worked had kept me from seeing and thinking. I think that's one of these things of, can I regret that? I do, but moving the regrets into trying to always have a better practice. I love that sense of kindness because I think that seeing the humanity of the people we work with, for me, I think really defending the term early career colleague for the students that I work with, rather than junior or student or people that I see that maybe see students as apprentices or worse. I think some of it is, you know, if we're lucky enough to do this for a lifetime, it's a lifetime learning curve. And sometimes we learn from the people that are fighting their way into the program who can tell us how we could do better.
I should say that I actually worry quite a bit about the students that we support with the Lewis and Clark grants this year and perhaps in the future, simply because of the problem that you refer to, which is if you go out of the country, are you going to be able to get back in? You know, we can't guarantee that, certainly. So it's something that we as sort of the mentors have to really be conscious of.
And if I can just add to that, I was president of the American Association of Biological Anthropologists during the Me Too movement. And it was a real wake-up call. And parallel to this, we also had quite an active diversity program to try to draw in people from all backgrounds into the association. And if we're talking specifically about conference organization and trying to be as inclusive as possible, this is something that has to come from the organizational side and raising the consciousness of those who are responsible for doing it. And my advice to you would have been to go to the organizers, explain your position. And it may not have, you know, had any result for the specific meeting you wanted to go to, but it might have seriously made them think about future meetings and how they were going to increase their inclusivity.
Yeah, this is to that aspect of participating in field work. And one of the things that our team considered a number of years ago is the expense of going in the field for an early career researcher or somebody, and particularly with changing politics and all of these issues of inclusivity, we negotiated with the tourist lodge we work with that no money had to be put up front. So basically you reserve your space, but you don't have to pay until you've actually shown up. So we've had people in this last field season, I had people who couldn't come because of visa issues, people who were afraid to fly because they didn't want to leave the country they were in, and there's so many issues that affect individual people, but across the board, nobody has to like pay money that they may lose up front. All you have to do is buy your plane ticket, and then if you cancel that, you get the money back or credit or something. But I feel like this is one thing that we can all do if we're bringing other people in to field sites is don't make them pay up front, because it's such an uncertain world right now that actually excludes people who may not have a lot of resources, but also may have a lot of fear. They don't want to commit to something that they're afraid is going to cost them if they change their mind. And so there shouldn't be a penalty for changing your mind about going in the field for any reason. And so I think that that's something kind of everybody can do, is if you can try and set things up so that people aren't penalized if they change their mind, that will make it more inclusive for everybody to be willing to say, well, I'm going to try and come. I'm going to try and go to this place, but if it doesn't work out, or if politics or visas or whatever go bad, or I'm just feeling really nervous right now and anxious about the world, then at least they don't have, at least it gives them more of it lowers the bar for participating for everybody.
Well, on that note, one last little bit of business. I don't want to eat dinner by myself tonight. So let's meet at 6 in the lobby, or let's talk if you're staying over to leave tomorrow. And let's just give one more round of applause for Linda and an amazing conference.